The great orbital station hung in the cold light of a dying star, its silver rings turning slowly as streams of ships came and went through the massive docking gates. And inside those endless halls, thousands of voices mingled, the sounds of 100 languages blending into one unending hum of trade and talk and movement. And for Mark, a human engineer who had come here for nothing more than a supply contract and a little quiet work, this place was both overwhelming and strangely beautiful because it was a place where worlds met and rules shifted, depending on who you spoke to and what you carried in your hands. Had been walking along the market sector, a vast space lined with high archways and stalls of glowing fabrics and shimmering crystals, machines that whispered to passersby in metallic tones, and food stands that sent up scents so strange they made his head swim. And as he passed through the crowd, he noticed that most people here barely glanced at him because humans were still a rarity, something curious but no longer new. Yet among the faces and shapes, his eyes caught sight of her. She stood near a vendor's table piled high with luminescent shells, her tall figure draped in flowing garments that shifted colors with every movement, her skin a soft pale gold that seemed to catch the dim light, her eyes wide and curious as she studied the merchant's goods. And something about her posture, graceful yet somehow guarded, made her stand out from the others, though Mark did not know why until he saw the two armored figures a few steps behind her, clearly guards by their stance and the way their eyes scanned the crowd. Mark might have kept walking, might have forgotten her in moments, if not for the sudden flash of movement to the left, a ripple in the steady rhythm of the crowd. And before he could even think, he saw a group of figures moving with sharp purpose, pushing through the throng, their hands hidden in folds of cloth and their eyes locked on the woman. And in that instant, he knew trouble was coming because their focus was too narrow, too intent. The first of them reached for her, a quick movement meant to pull her away before anyone noticed. But Mark was already moving, his instincts kicking in faster than thought, his hand grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting hard as he stepped in close, using the force of surprise to send the figure stumbling into a stall of metal tools. And as the guards reacted, drawing their weapons, two more attackers surged forward, one of them swinging a blade that glimmered faintly with some alien energy. And Mark ducked low, catching the attacker's legs and driving forward, sending them both crashing into the market floor. The crowd erupted into chaos, people shouting, vendors pulling their goods back, and Mark felt the adrenaline burn through him as he scrambled back to his feet, only to find another attacker trying to slip behind the woman. And without thinking, he threw himself between them, blocking the path, his arm catching the attacker across the chest and forcing them back toward the guards, who finished the job with quick, practiced strikes. It was over in moments, the attackers scattering or collapsing under the guards' blows, the noise of the crowd settling into a tense murmur, and Mark stood breathing hard, his hands tingling from the fight, while the woman turned to look at him with an expression he could not quite read. Something like surprise and something else he could not name. The guards moved in close, speaking rapidly in a language he did not understand, but the woman raised her hand to silence them, her eyes never leaving his. And then she stepped forward, close enough that he could see the faint golden patterns on her skin and hear the calm steadiness of her voice as she spoke in clear trade language. "You have saved my life," she said, her tone soft but heavy with meaning. "And by the ancient law of my people, this means you have claimed me." Mark blinked, sure he had heard her wrong, and for a moment he almost laughed because it sounded like some kind of strange joke. But the way she stood there, unblinking and perfectly serious, made the air around them feel heavier, and the guard's silence only confirmed that this was no mistake. He opened his mouth to say something, anything to make sense of the words, but she continued before he could speak, explaining that in her culture, life was bound to life when saved in danger, that by taking her from the hands of death, he had bound her fate to his, and though he could refuse. Doing so would bring dishonor that would echo through families and councils, and even across the fragile treaties that held their people together. Mark's heart was still pounding from the fight, but now there was a different kind of pressure, a sense that he had just stepped into something much larger than himself. And he looked around at the watching crowd, at the merchants whispering behind their stalls, at the way even strangers seemed to know what her words meant, and he realized that whatever choice he made next would not be made in private. The guards began to clear the area, moving the attackers' bodies and herding the curious onlookers away, and the woman gestured for him to follow, her presence commanding yet strangely inviting. And Mark found himself walking beside her, his mind racing with questions he could not yet form, because somewhere deep inside he knew this was the moment his life had shifted onto a path he had never imagined as they left the market sector behind and stepped into a quieter corridor lined with tall windows looking out into the starfield. The dying sun's red light washing over them, Mark felt a strange mix of awe and dread, wondering who she truly was, what her people's law would demand of him, and why some part of him, despite all his confusion, was not entirely sure he wanted to walk away from it. The corridor stretched ahead with its polished metal walls, glinting faintly in the light that filtered through tall viewpanes, and Mark kept pace with the woman, though his mind was a storm of questions that had no time to form into words because she moved with quiet certainty. Her steps neither hurried nor slow, as if she knew exactly where she was leading him and exactly what would happen once they arrived, and the two guards followed behind like silent shadows, their armor making only the faintest sound with each step. They turned into a circular chamber where the ceiling arched high above like the inside of a great dome, the air here carrying a faint scent of something sweet and metallic, and in the center was a table carved from some dark stone that seemed to drink in the light, around which a few older figures stood waiting, their robes marked with patterns that told of rank and heritage, though Mark could not read them. And as soon as the woman entered the chamber, they inclined their heads in deep respect, which made him realize that she was not just important. She was someone whose very presence changed the behavior of those around her. She gestured for him to step closer to the table, and when he did, one of the older figures began to speak in a calm and steady tone, the words in trade language but wrapped in a formality that made them feel heavier, explaining the tradition in clear detail so there could be no mistake, telling him that in their law the act of saving a life was not simply a kindness, it was a binding that wove together the fates of savior and saved, and that this bond could not be broken without severe insult to honor and position, not just for the two involved, but for their families, and in this case for the political councils of two species that were already walking a fragile line between alliance and rivalry. Mark listened, trying to keep his expression steady, though inside he felt the weight pressing down harder with every word, because the elder explained that he had two choices: to accept the bond and thus accept her as his mate in the eyes of her people, or to reject it in front of witnesses, which would mark both of them as dishonored, and would give enemies of the alliance fuel to turn sentiment against humans. And as much as Mark disliked the idea of being forced into anything, he knew enough about diplomacy to see the trouble such a rejection would bring. The woman watched him as the explanation ended, her golden eyes calm yet filled with something he could not quite name, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a quiet testing of what kind of man he was. And when the elder finished, she spoke herself, telling him in a voice that was soft yet unshakable, that she did not expect blind acceptance, but that she would not pretend to be indifferent either. For in her people's heart a life saved was a life intertwined, and to deny that would be to deny the deepest part of their being. Mark ran a hand over his face, feeling the tightness in his chest, and asked her why her people still followed such a tradition in a galaxy full of cultures that had left such things behind. And she told him it was because honor was the one currency that never lost its value, that alliances made without it could crumble at the first test, and that when someone risked their own life for another. That act was not something that could be repaid with a thank you and a handshake. It demanded recognition, a place in their lives equal to the place in which that risk had been taken. The two guards stepped forward then, speaking quietly to her, in their own tongue, and Mark noticed the way her expression tightened just a little. And when she turned back to him, she explained that news of the incident in the market had already spread across the station, that other factions would be interpreting his decision before he even made it, and that there were those who would use any hesitation as a sign that humans did not value the lives of her people, which could sway the upcoming diplomatic vote away from cooperation and toward isolation. Mark felt the knot in his stomach grow because now it was not just about him and her. It was about the fact that an entire political bridge might burn depending on his next step. And he hated being pushed into a corner, yet he also could not ignore the truth that his actions had already tied him to her in the eyes of everyone who mattered in this place. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that walking away might be impossible without starting a fire that no one could put out. She stepped closer then, close enough that the faint shift in colors in her garments reflected in his eyes. And she told him that she understood humans valued choice, that she had studied their ways enough to know they did not bind themselves by law in such matters. But she asked him to understand that she too had no choice, because if he refused her, she would carry that mark for the rest of her life. And the echo of it would touch her family, her future, and her people's trust in those she was meant to represent. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the silence filled with the soft hum of the station systems. And Mark found himself looking into her eyes and wondering how much of what she said was tradition and how much was her own will. Because there was a steadiness in her gaze that made him think she was not merely reciting words she had been taught, but speaking something she truly believed. And he realized that he wanted to know more about her, not just because of the bond, but because there was something in her presence that pulled at him in a way he did not understand. The elders seemed to sense the weight of the moment, and they told him there would be no demand for an answer that instant, that he would be given time until the next cycle to decide. But they warned him that the longer he waited, the more the rumors would grow, and the harder it would be to contain the political ripples. And with that, they dismissed the gathering, the guards once again taking positions at her side as she led him out into the corridor as they walked together through the quieter levels of the station, the market noise far behind them. Mark found himself glancing at her from the corner of his eye, trying to decide if she was a stranger tied to him by accident, or someone whose path had been meant to cross his in a way he could not yet see. And though he told himself not to get pulled too deep, there was already a part of him that knew he was standing at the edge of something that could change not just his life, but the shape of the fragile galaxy around them. The next cycle on the station began with the faint shift of lighting along the corridors and the low chime that signaled a change in the schedule for shops and docking bays. But for Mark, the change in light did nothing to ease the weight that had settled in his thoughts, because the memory of the attack in the market and the words spoken in that domed chamber still circled in his mind. And the more he considered them, the less they felt like an isolated incident, and the more they seemed like the first visible piece of something much larger and hidden. Beneath the surface, he had agreed to meet her again that morning, not in the formal council spaces, but in one of the quieter sections of the station where the walls curved with windows, looking out over the ships that drifted in the docking zone. And when she arrived, the two guards were still with her, though they hung back at a respectful distance, their eyes moving over every passerby, as if each one might be another threat. And Mark noticed that their watchfulness was sharper now, as if the attack had changed their sense of danger from a possibility to an expectation. When they sat at a small table near the glass, the glow of the distant star outlining her profile, she spoke first, telling him that her people had already started an investigation into the mercenaries who had tried to take her, and that early reports showed they were not wandering criminals, but hired agents, And the troubling part was that the credits that paid them had come from an account tied to a faction known for opposing cooperation with humans and for seeking to keep her people isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Mark leaned forward, listening carefully, because this was the first time she had spoken of her enemies directly, and she told him that this faction saw the upcoming diplomatic vote as a threat to their power, for if the treaty passed it would create trade routes and defense pacts that would weaken the grip they held over certain sectors, and that in their eyes removing her from the talks would be an effective way to delay or destroy the agreement entirely. He asked her if she thought the attack in the market had been meant to kill her or simply to remove her quietly, and she said it was hard to know. For in her culture the line between those two goals could blur, since taking someone alive could be used for political bargaining, while ending their life could be used for fueling hostility toward another group, and both ends could serve the same purpose if carried out with care and the right message. More she spoke, the clearer it became that this was not just a personal matter, but a web of politics and power. And Mark found himself asking how his role in all of this truly fit, because while he understood the bond law and the appearance it created, he did not see why the faction would care so much about a single human's connection to her. And she explained that it was not only about him. It was about the symbol, that a human standing beside her in the council would be a visible sign of the Alliance's reality, a living image that would strengthen the vote in favor of the treaty, and that was exactly what the faction wished to prevent. They spoke for a long while, until one of the guards received a silent signal on a wrist device and came forward to whisper in her ear. And Mark saw her eyes narrow just slightly before she rose and told him that a lead had been found on the group responsible, but that it was not in a safe or public place, and she asked him if he would be willing to come with her, for though the guards were skilled, she believed his presence could be an advantage, not only because of his quick action in the market, but because the people they would meet might be more willing to speak in front of someone who was not part of her usual circle. Mark hesitated only for a moment before agreeing, because part of him felt drawn deeper into the situation, not only by duty but by the quiet strength she carried. And soon they were moving through the underlevels of the station, far from the polished halls and bright markets, down into the narrow maintenance corridors where the lights flickered and the hum of engines was louder than the voices of those who passed. They came at last to a sealed service hatch guarded by two figures in worn armor, and after a brief exchange in the woman's language, the hatch opened, revealing a dim space beyond where the air was heavy with the scent of oil and heated metal. And inside, scattered around low tables, were several individuals whose faces were lined with the kind of caution that came from living too close to trouble. And when they saw her enter, they shifted uneasily as if unsure whether to welcome her or fear what her presence meant. The talks began slowly, with guarded words and long silences, but piece by piece information emerged, and Mark learned that mercenaries had been hired through a chain of cutouts meant to hide the true employer. But one of those cutouts had made a mistake, a transaction too large to be unnoticed, and it had been traced back to a storage bay registered under the name of a front company tied to the faction she had spoken of. And this storage bay was not far from the docking area for several long-range ships, suggesting that it could be both a base and a launch point for further operations. By the time they left the dim meeting space, the station lights had shifted again, casting a colder hue through the corridors, and the woman's expression was more tense than before. For the evidence pointed to something she had feared from the start, that the attack in the market had only been the first move in a series, and that the faction might not stop at removing her, but might try to sabotage the entire station during the treaty gathering to make cooperation impossible. Mark walked beside her in silence for a while, thinking about the scope of what they were stepping into, and he could not help but feel the strange weight of the bond law again, not as a chain forcing him to act, but as a thread pulling him along paths he would never have taken otherwise. And as they neared the higher levels of the station, he realized that whatever choice he made about the bond would now be tied to something far larger than himself, because the safety of her, and perhaps the future of the treaty, might depend on whether he stayed at her side. The day of the diplomatic gathering drew closer, and the station began to feel different, as if its very structure carried the tension in the air, and the corridors filled with delegates from distant worlds, each bringing their own guards and advisors, while the docking bays swarmed with ships unloading cargo meant for the great banquet that would follow the signing if the treaty passed. And in the midst of this rising tide of movement, Mark found himself spending more time with her than he had ever expected, learning not only the patterns of her speech and the small shifts in her expression, but also the way she seemed to notice details others missed, the way her gaze would pause on a vent panel slightly out of place, or a maintenance worker wearing a uniform a shade too dark. It was during one such walk through the upper promenade that she slowed and drew him toward the edge, where a row of tall windows overlooked the central docking core, and in the web of moving ships and cargo drones, she pointed to a small vessel tucked between two bulk freighters, its hull a dull gray that made it blend into the metal backdrop, yet she said it had been there for longer than docking rules allowed, and that according to her guard's quiet inquiries, it was registered under a false name linked again to the same front company from the storage bay lead. Decided that waiting for the council's security teams to act might be too slow, because by the time official channels moved, the ship could be gone, taking whatever plan it carried out of reach. So instead she proposed something bolder and far more dangerous: that they would go themselves under the cover of a simple inspection. Mark felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that always came before he stepped into something risky. But he also knew there was no turning back, because this was no longer just her fight, and the thought of leaving her to face it alone was something he could not accept. The approach to the vessel was a careful game of blending in, as two of her guards led the way, carrying the false paperwork of a maintenance inspection, while Mark and she followed at a slight distance, their pace steady and unhurried, as if they belonged there. And when the hatch opened with a reluctant hiss, the stale air inside told them the ship had not been moved in some time. Yet there was a hum from deeper within that spoke of active systems running quietly like a heartbeat. Under the metal skin inside, the corridors were narrow and dim, lit only by thin strips of pale light along the ceiling, and the walls carried the smell of heated wiring and the faint tang of something chemical. Mark moved behind one guard while she stayed close enough that he could hear her breathing, steady but deliberate, and together they reached the central hold where the source of the hum became clear. Rows of small devices stacked in crates, each with a faint glow along their sides, and a control module at the far wall. One of the guards approached the nearest crate and pried it open, revealing the sleek shape of an explosive charge, the kind designed not for open destruction, but for targeted pressure breaches that could tear through the station's structural joints without a massive outward blast, meaning they could cripple the station without triggering full defensive lockdowns. The sight of so many in one place sent a cold rush through Mark, because it meant the faction was not just planning to cause trouble, they were preparing to make the entire gathering impossible by turning the station into a hazard zone. They could discuss how to dismantle or remove them. The sound of boots echoed from deeper in the ship, and the guards signaled for silence. Mark felt his pulse rise as shadows moved in the corridor ahead, and soon several armed figures emerged, their armor marked with the same subtle insignia he had glimpsed on one of the attackers in the market. The moment of stillness between the two groups stretched thin like glass, and then shattered as the first shot rang out, bright energy flashing in the narrow space. The fight that followed was sharp and chaotic, with the cramped corridors forcing close combat. Mark ducked behind a crate, pulling her with him as shots struck the walls, sending sparks across the metal floor. One of the guards took down an attacker with a swift strike, while the other blocked the path to the control module, but the numbers were against them, and Mark realized they could not hold this position long. So he searched the room for anything that could shift the balance. and his eyes landed on a manual release valve connected to the ship's internal pressure system. Without hesitating, he yanked it open, and a violent rush of air roared through the compartment, forcing the attackers to stagger as they fought to keep their footing. And in that moment, the guards pushed forward, driving them back toward the far corridor. She moved with them, quick and precise, her eyes locked on the control module, and together they reached it, Mark slamming his hand against the emergency cutout that killed the device's active signals, shutting down the explosives before any remote detonation could be sent. With the attackers retreating under the combined pressure of the guards and the cords' sudden shift in air systems, they secured the hold and sealed the hatch behind them. But the victory felt thin, because this was only one ship, and the way the leader among the attackers had looked at her before vanishing into the shadows told Mark that this was not over, that there were more pieces moving on the board, and they would not stop until the treaty failed or worse. Back in the safety of a quiet transit corridor, she turned to him, her golden eyes intense, and said that now he must see why the bond could not be taken lightly, because whether he liked it or not, his presence had already marked him as part of this fight. And if the faction wanted to strike at her, they might strike at him as well. Mark met her gaze and told her that walking away now would not change that, and in that moment, the unspoken line between duty and choice blurred until it was almost gone. And he understood that he was not staying because of the bond alone, but because something in her resolve had become part of his own. Hours that followed were a blur of movement and quiet urgency as security teams swept through the docking bays, and inspection crews checked every ship scheduled to remain on the station during the treaty gathering. Yet even as report after report came in, there was no sign of the leader who had escaped from the gray vessel, and the absence of his capture was like a shadow stretching across their preparations for the next day's ceremony. Mark felt it in the way the guards moved more sharply than before, and in the way she spoke with the council members, her words steady yet laced with attention. She could not afford to show in public. The great hall where the treaty would be signed was unlike any other place on the station, a vast chamber of glass and silver arches with a floor that reflected the light of the dying star through the broad windows, and already the long table stood ready with seats marked for each delegate. The air here carried the low hum of energy shields woven into the walls, a sign of the heightened protection. Yet Mark knew from the ship raid that the faction would not rely only on open attack. Their plan would be layered with misdirection and time to strike. When eyes were turned towards speeches and ceremony, the gathering began, the hall filled with the sound of different voices speaking in their own tongues, each marked by distinct tones and rhythms that seemed to weave into one living pattern. The council chair called for the assembly to settle, and the first speakers began to address the room, each outlining the reasons for the treaty and the hopes it carried for trade, defense, and cultural exchange. And Mark stood at her side, aware of the curious looks from many of the delegates, who now knew the story of the bond between them and what it meant under her people's law. Halfway through the speeches, he caught a flicker of movement near the upper maintenance balconies, a place where only staff should have been, and when his eyes tracked the figure there, he saw the glint of metal and the subtle gesture of someone signaling to another unseen hand. Without a word, he touched her arm, and she read his expression, instantly turning to the nearest guard with a quick command. The guard moved fast, but the danger moved faster as a sudden surge of static rolled through the hall's systems, cutting off the live feeds and dimming the lights, just enough for confusion to ripple through the crowd. Mark pushed through the nearest side passage, drawing her with him. As the guards fanned out, they reached the base of a narrow stair that led to the upper balconies, and as they climbed, the metallic scent of the air grew stronger, a sure sign of weapons primed for use. At the top, they found the leader waiting, his armor scorched from their last encounter, yet his posture calm, his voice sharp as he declared that the treaty would never be signed under threat from humans, and that today the galaxy would see the proof of their danger. The fight was tight and fierce in the narrow balcony. Mark forced him back with quick strikes, But the leader fought with the desperation of one who knew he had only one chance to succeed below them. The hall echoed with the noise of rising panic as a second faction member attempted to plant a small device at the base of the central arch. She broke from the fight long enough to leap down onto the lower platform, landing with the grace of someone who had trained for such moments, and in one smooth movement, she ripped the device free and flung it into the waiting hands of a guard, who sealed it in a containment case before it could trigger. Mark pressed his advantage in the fight, above driving the leader toward the railing until with one final push, he sent him crashing over the side to land stunned on the hard floor where the guards moved in to secure him. The moment the danger passed, the lights returned to full brightness and the comm systems cleared, filling the hall with the relieved murmur of voices as the council chair called for calm and announced that the threat had been neutralized and that the treaty signing would proceed without further delay. When they returned to the table, the eyes of the assembly were on them, but Mark felt none of the earlier uncertainty, because now there was no question that he was not merely a figure caught in a tradition. He was part of the reason this day would succeed. The council chair invited her to speak, and she rose with the calm poise of someone who knew the weight of the moment. She told them that the bond between her and the human beside her had been formed by accident, but had been honored by choice, and that in the face of danger, they had stood together, not as symbols forced into place, but as equals who had chosen to fight for one another. Her words brought a quiet stillness to the hall before the chair called for the final vote, and when the results flashed across the display, the treaty had passed by a wide margin. The applause that followed was a rolling wave that filled the chamber, and outside the great windows the light of the dying star spilled across the station, turning the metal arches to gold. Later, as the hall emptied and the delegates left for the celebration, Mark and she stood by the window in the quiet, her guards keeping a respectful distance. She turned to him and said that by her people's oldest law he had claimed her life, but by the oldest truth, she knew she now claimed his, not as a debt, but as a choice. He smiled faintly, feeling for the first time that the strange path that had begun in the chaos of the market had led them here, not by chance alone, but by the kind of shared resolve that could bridge the space between worlds. And as the station drifted on its slow path around the fading sun, they stood together in the golden light, knowing the bond they carried was no longer only a tradition, it was a promise for whatever came next. The end.